I inherited $250,000 from my grandmother when she passed away last spring. She left it all to me because I was the one who spent her final 3 years driving her to doctor appointments every single week, sitting with her through chemotherapy and holding her hand when she was scared. My older brother Kyle was too busy climbing the corporate ladder to visit more than twice a year. When the lawyer read the will, Kyle nodded quietly. My parents seemed understanding. Everything felt right. Then 2 months later, Kyle called to tell me he was engaged, and suddenly everything changed. Before I tell you how my own family tried to rob me blind, let me know where you are watching from, and if you have ever dealt with entitled relatives, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you will want to see how I handled this. The inheritance was not just luck. For 3 solid years, I rearranged my entire life around Grandma's needs. Every Wednesday morning, I took her to oncology appointments at the hospital 40 minutes away. I learned how to help her with medications, how to cook the bland foods she could stomach during treatment, and how to just sit quietly when the pain got too bad for conversation. Kyle, meanwhile, was in a different state, chasing promotions and networking events. He sent flowers on her birthday and called on holidays, but that was about it. My parents lived 6 hours away and visited when they could, but the daily grind fell on me. When Grandma's lawyer called me into his office that gray afternoon in March, I honestly expected maybe a few $1,000s and some family heirlooms. Instead, he slid a document across his desk, showing the full amount. $250,000. I sat there, stunned, reading her handwritten note attached to the will. She wrote that I gave her comfort in her darkest hours, that I never made her feel like a burden, and that she wanted me to build a good life with this money. I cried right there in that office. Kyle attended the will reading. When the lawyer announced the amount and that it was all going to me, I watched my brother's face carefully. He blinked a few times, swallowed hard, then reached over and squeezed my shoulder. He said Grandma made the right choice. My parents hugged me afterward and said they were proud of how I cared for her. Nobody protested. Nobody complained. I thought we were good. I started making plans immediately. I wanted to buy a small house, something cozy with a yard where I could plant tomatoes like Grandma used to grow. As a junior accountant making $42,000 a year, I never imagined owning property before 30. This inheritance was my ticket to stability. I met with a financial advisor, opened a high-yield savings account, and started looking at neighborhoods. Then, in May, Kyle called with big news. He was engaged to Stephanie, a woman he had been dating for 6 months. I was genuinely happy for him. We met up for coffee, and he showed me photos of the proposal at some fancy restaurant downtown. Stephanie seemed nice enough in the pictures, all smiles and a huge diamond ring. Kyle said they were planning an autumn wedding and wanted to do it right. I congratulated him and asked if he needed help with anything. A week later, my parents hosted an engagement dinner at an upscale Italian restaurant. The whole family came out. Stephanie arrived wearing designer clothes and talking about wedding venues she had been researching. She worked as a marketing manager for a tech startup and clearly enjoyed the finer things. Throughout dinner, she kept mentioning their dream wedding, describing crystal chandeliers and live orchestras and imported flowers. Kyle beamed beside her, nodding along to every extravagant detail. I pulled Kyle aside before dessert and handed him an envelope with a check for $1,000. I told him to put it toward whatever they needed. His smile faltered slightly as he opened it. Stephanie glanced over his shoulder and I watched her expression freeze. She recovered quickly and said it was a sweet gesture, but they would need quite a bit more than that to pull off what they envisioned. The comment stung, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just nervous about wedding costs. The first real warning sign came the following Tuesday. Kyle called me at work, his voice tight with stress. He said the venue they wanted required a $5,000 deposit by Friday, or they would lose the date. He asked if I could lend it to him just temporarily. He promised his company was giving out quarterly bonuses in 3 months, and he would pay me back immediately. I hesitated. $5,000 was a decent chunk of money, but this was my brother's wedding. I said yes. Kyle's relief was palpable through the phone. He thanked me repeatedly and said I was saving their lives. He promised I would be his best man, that this wedding would be incredible, and that he would never forget this favor. I transferred the money that afternoon and tried not to think about it too much. 2 weeks later, my phone rang again. Kyle needed another $10,000. This time for the photographer and videographer. Apparently, Stephanie found this amazing team that had shot weddings for minor celebrities, and they were only available if they booked immediately. I felt my stomach tighten. $10,000 was serious money. I asked Kyle how they were planning to pay for all this if they needed to keep borrowing. He got defensive, saying Stephanie wanted their wedding to be perfect, that you only get married once, and that his little brother should understand that. I told him I needed to think about it. That night, I got a text message from Stephanie directly. She sent me links to the venue, the photographer's portfolio, and the videographer's highlight reels. Everything looked expensive and stunning. Her message said that a real brother would want his sibling to have the best day of their lives. That I had been blessed with Grandma's money, and this was my chance to share that blessing. I felt sick reading it. This was manipulation clear as day. I texted back saying I needed to save for my own future and could not keep funding their wedding. I suggested they consider a smaller budget. Stephanie read the message but never replied. 20 minutes later, Kyle called furious. He said I was being selfish and that Grandma would be ashamed of me. Then he hung up. My mother called the next evening. Her voice carried disappointment that made me feel 12 years old again. She said Kyle was devastated and Stephanie had been crying all afternoon. Mom gently reminded me that I had all that money from Grandma sitting in the bank. What was a few $1,000s compared to family harmony? I tried to explain my position, but she cut me off, saying she had to go. The call left me feeling guilty and confused. My father called 2 days later with a softer approach. He said he understood I wanted to be responsible with my inheritance, and that was admirable. But he also said Kyle was my only sibling and weddings were important milestones. Could I not find it in my heart to help out just a little more? I told Dad I already gave them $6,000. He went quiet, then said he did not realize it was that much already. He suggested we all sit down and talk things through as a family. 3 weeks passed in uncomfortable silence. Then Mom called to invite me to Sunday dinner at their house. She said it was important, and that Kyle and Stephanie would be there too. She wanted us to work things out like adults. I agreed, hoping we could find some middle ground. I arrived at 6 p.m. on Sunday to find the dining room table set formally. Kyle and Stephanie showed up 20 minutes late, barely acknowledging me when they walked in. We sat down to pot roast, and the tension was thick enough to cut. My parents made small talk about the weather and their garden. Kyle stared at his plate. Stephanie checked her phone repeatedly. Finally, halfway through dinner, Kyle set down his fork and looked directly at me. He said they needed to discuss something important. Stephanie pulled out her tablet and opened a spreadsheet. My brother cleared his throat and said they had been crunching numbers for weeks. After careful consideration of all their options, they determined they needed $100,000 from my inheritance to make their dream wedding happen. I actually laughed. I thought he was joking, but nobody else smiled. Kyle's face remained serious. Stephanie turned the tablet toward me, showing a detailed breakdown of costs. Venue rental catering for 200 guests, flowers, photography, videography, designer dress, custom suits, honeymoon in Bali. The total came to just over $300,000. They expected me to cover a third of it. I looked at my parents. Mom studied her napkin. Dad focused on cutting his meat. Neither of them said a word in my defense. I turned back to Kyle and asked if he had lost his mind. He launched into a speech about how Grandma would have wanted us both to be happy, how she would want me to help my brother on his big day, how the money came from our shared family, so really it should be shared between us. Stephanie jumped in, saying they had been planning this for months. Everything was already booked. They could not possibly downgrade now without losing deposits and looking foolish in front of their friends. She said I was sitting on a fortune I did nothing to earn while they were struggling to create one perfect day. Her voice dripped with entitlement that made my blood boil. I asked why they booked things they could not afford. Kyle slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. He shouted that he thought he could count on his brother, that family was supposed to support each other, that I was being greedy and selfish. Mom finally spoke up, asking everyone to calm down. But she did not tell Kyle he was wrong. She did not defend me. She just asked us to lower our voices. I left before dessert. I walked out of that house shaking with anger and hurt. My own parents sat there and let Kyle berate me for not handing over money that Grandma specifically left to me. I drove home and sat in my car for an hour trying to process what had just happened. The next 2 weeks were brutal. I received text messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins I barely spoke to. All of them had somehow heard about the situation. All of them had opinions. My Aunt Sarah said family helps family. Uncle Tom reminded me that I was young and would make more money, but Kyle would only get married once. My cousin Jennifer sent a long message about how Grandma would be disappointed in my selfishness. I felt attacked from every direction. These people had no idea what I sacrificed for Grandma. They did not sit with her during bad test results or hold her hair back when she got sick from treatments. Yet they all felt qualified to tell me what to do with the money she left me. Stephanie made things worse on social media. She posted photos of wedding planning with captions like, "So grateful for the family members who truly support our journey and finding out who really has your back when it matters." People who knew both of us started asking me why I was not helping my brother. The gossip spread through our social circle like wildfire. Then Kyle showed up at my office. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly reports when the receptionist called to say my brother was in the lobby asking for me. I went down and we talked in the parking lot beside his car. Stephanie sat in the passenger seat watching us through the window. Kyle got straight to the point. He wanted all of it. All $250,000. He said I did not earn that money. That grandma just gave it to me because I sucked up to her those last few years while he was building his career. That he deserved half of it at minimum. If I truly loved him as a brother, I would split the inheritance equally and let him have this wedding. I stared at him in disbelief. This was a person I shared a childhood with. We built forts together, played video games for hours, protected each other from bullies at school. Now he stood in front of me demanding every penny of my inheritance with a straight face. Stephanie got out of the car and walked over. She looked at me with cold eyes and said if I was not going to help them, I should not expect an invitation to the wedding or any family events going forward. Kyle delivered the final blow. He said if I did not give them the money, I should not expect to be part of this family anymore. They would cut me off completely. Then they got in their car and drove away, leaving me standing there stunned. That night I could not sleep. I kept replaying the conversation, feeling betrayed and furious. I started thinking about the timeline. Kyle and Stephanie had only been dating 6 months before getting engaged. Yet, they immediately started planning an elaborate wedding that cost more than most people's annual salary. They booked expensive vendors before securing funding. Stephanie somehow knew exactly how much I inherited right down to the dollar. Something did not add up. I called a friend who worked at Kyle's company. I asked casual questions about how business was going. My friend mentioned that Kyle definitely was not getting a bonus anytime soon. In fact, the company had just announced budget cuts and a hiring freeze. Kyle had lied about the bonus. That information pushed me over the edge. I decided to dig deeper. I found a private investigator online, read reviews, and hired someone to look into Kyle and Stephanie's financial situation. It cost me $500, but I needed to know the truth. The investigator's report arrived exactly 1 week later, in a thick manila envelope. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 p.m., reading through page after page of documentation, and my hands started shaking. Kyle was drowning in debt. Credit card statements showed he owed nearly $80,000 across 5 different cards, all maxed out. The purchases dated back almost 2 years. Expensive dinners, designer clothes, luxury hotel stays, tech gadgets. He had been living well beyond his means for a long time, and it finally caught up with him. Stephanie was even worse. She had 3 credit cards completely maxed, totaling $67,000 in debt. Her credit score was 512. She had 2 collections agencies actively pursuing her for unpaid medical bills and a defaulted car loan. Together, they were buried under nearly $150,000 of debt, not including the wedding expenses they were racking up. The investigator found something else. Email exchanges between Kyle and Stephanie from before they even got engaged. The PI had a source who worked at Stephanie's company and accessed her work email. I know it sounds invasive, but I had to know. One email from Stephanie to Kyle dated 3 weeks before he proposed. Once we get the money from your naive brother, we can pay off our debts and still have enough left over for a decent wedding. You said he got $250,000 right. That solves everything. Kyle's response: he owes me anyway. I should have gotten half of Grandma's money. She always liked him better just because he had time to kiss up to her. I was building my career. Once we are married, we will get that money one way or another. Trust me. Another email from Stephanie sent 2 days after their engagement dinner. Your brother only gave us $1,000. Seriously, we need to turn up the pressure. Get your parents involved. Make him feel guilty. He is a soft target. He will cave eventually. I read those words over and over until they burned into my brain. This entire engagement, this whole wedding drama, was a calculated scheme to get my inheritance. They planned it from the start. Kyle did not love Stephanie. They were 2 desperate people drowning in debt who saw my grandmother's money as a life raft. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom. Another family dinner planned for that Saturday. She said it was important, and everyone needed to be there. Extended family would be coming. I knew what this was. Another ambush. Another attempt to pressure me into giving up the money. But this time I would be ready. I spent the next 3 days making copies of everything. The investigator's report, the credit card statements, printed screenshots of the emails. I organized it all into a folder and rehearsed what I would say. My hands sweated just thinking about it, but I knew this had to end. Saturday arrived cold and rainy. I drove to my parents' house and saw cars lining the street. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone was there. I walked in carrying my folder and immediately felt all eyes on me. The dining room had been set up with extra tables. At least 20 people packed into the space. Kyle and Stephanie sat at the head table with a laptop. My stomach sank. They had a presentation ready. This was going to be a full-scale production designed to humiliate me into submission. I took a seat near the back and waited. After appetizers, Kyle stood up and clinked his glass. He announced that he and Stephanie wanted to share their wedding plans with the whole family. Stephanie opened the laptop and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on the wall via a projector they had set up, professional slides with photos of venues and flowers and cake designs. They went through slide after slide explaining every detail of their dream wedding. The venue that cost $40,000 to rent, the celebrity florist charging $18,000, the designer dress at $12,000, the Bali honeymoon at $35,000, every expense carefully itemized. The final slide showed the total $320,000. Then Kyle dropped the bomb. He announced, smiling broadly, that his generous little brother Brant had agreed to contribute his entire inheritance to make this dream come true. The room erupted in applause. People were clapping and cheering. My mother had tears in her eyes. Stephanie beamed like she had just won the lottery. I sat completely still, watching this circus unfold. Kyle looked directly at me and said, "See, I knew you would come around, little brother. Family always comes through." Stephanie started passing out wedding invitations to everyone at the tables. People came up to hug me and tell me how selfless I was being. I waited until the noise died down. Then I stood up and raised my hand. I asked if I could say a few words. Kyle nodded, still grinning like an idiot. Everyone turned to look at me. The room went quiet. I opened my folder and pulled out the first document. In a calm, steady voice, I started reading. I read out loud, Kyle's credit card debt total, $80,000. I heard gasps. I read Stephanie's debt total, $67,000. More gasps. I read about the collections agencies, the defaulted loans, the abysmal credit scores. Kyle's face went white. Stephanie stood up and tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I pulled out the printed emails. I read Stephanie's words about me being a naive target. I read Kyle's message about me owing him and kissing up to Grandma. I read their plan to manipulate me out of my inheritance to cover their irresponsible spending. The room was dead silent. You could hear the rain hitting the windows. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father stared at Kyle with an expression I had never seen before. Aunt Sarah looked disgusted. Uncle Tom shook his head slowly. I looked at Kyle and Stephanie and said clearly, "I will not give you a single cent." I explained that Grandma left me that money because I earned it through years of caregiving. Kyle made his choice to prioritize his career over family. That was fine, but it did not entitle him to my inheritance. I did not owe anyone anything. I said if they wanted an expensive wedding, they needed to figure out how to pay for it themselves like normal adults. Maybe they should focus on paying off their massive debt instead of planning $300,000 parties they could not afford. I announced I was withdrawing from the wedding party and would not be attending. Then I walked out. Behind me, chaos erupted. I heard Kyle trying to explain, Stephanie crying, my mother demanding answers. I got in my car and drove away feeling lighter than I had in months. My phone exploded with messages that night. Kyle sent a long, rambling text trying to justify everything. He claimed the emails were taken out of context. That yes, they had debt, but everyone has debt. That I humiliated him in front of the entire family. Stephanie sent her own message calling me cruel and vindictive. I blocked both of their numbers and went to bed. The next morning, my mother called. Her voice was thick from crying. She said she was so sorry. That she and Dad had no idea about Kyle's financial situation or the manipulation. They thought he was doing well at work and that the wedding requests were just normal family support. She said she was ashamed they pressured me instead of protecting me. Dad got on the phone too and apologized. He said they failed me as parents during all of this. I appreciated their apology, but I told them I needed time. I needed space from all of this. I explained that I would be setting firm boundaries going forward, especially regarding Kyle. I made it clear I would never lend him money again for any reason. They understood and respected my decision. Over the next 2 weeks, I heard through my parents what happened with the wedding. Kyle and Stephanie had to cancel the expensive venue. They lost their deposits, which they had put on credit cards. They canceled the celebrity florist, the fancy photographer, all of it. Instead, they ended up having a small ceremony in Stephanie's parents' backyard with about 30 guests. There was no professional photographer, just a friend taking pictures with an iPhone. No designer dress, no live band, no imported flowers. Stephanie still posted a few photos on social media, but the comments were sparse. Most people had heard what happened and distanced themselves from the drama. A mutual friend asked me why I did not attend. I explained briefly that Kyle and I had a falling out over financial issues, and I thought it was best to stay away. I did not trash talk him. I did not need to. The truth had already done enough damage. I used my inheritance exactly as I planned. I found a beautiful little house in a quiet neighborhood 30 minutes outside the city. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a backyard with enough space for a garden. The moment I walked through it, I felt at peace. It reminded me of Grandma's house somehow. The way sunlight came through the kitchen windows, the old oak tree in the yard. I put down a solid down payment and got a mortgage I could easily afford on my accountant's salary. I moved in during October, right when the leaves were changing colors. I spent weekends painting walls and planting bulbs that would bloom in spring. Every night I came home to a place that was mine, paid for with money I earned through love and sacrifice. The rest of the inheritance went into smart investments. I maxed out my retirement accounts. I built an emergency fund with 6 months of expenses. I set up a college fund, even though I do not have kids yet, because someday I might. I met with financial advisors and made sure every dollar was working for my future. My relationship with my parents slowly healed. We had dinner once a month and they never brought up Kyle unless I asked. They respected my boundaries completely. They seemed genuinely remorseful for how they handled everything. Mom told me she was proud of the house I bought and that Grandma would have loved it. That meant more to me than she knew. Kyle tried reaching out a few times. Texts, on holidays, a birthday card. I never responded. I needed him to understand that actions have consequences, that you cannot manipulate people and then expect everything to go back to normal. Maybe someday we would rebuild some kind of relationship, but not anytime soon. About a year after the wedding disaster, my mother mentioned during dinner that Kyle and Stephanie were getting divorced. Apparently, once the wedding was over and reality set in, they could not handle the pressure of their combined debt. They fought constantly about money. Stephanie blamed Kyle for the family embarrassment. Kyle blamed Stephanie for pushing the expensive wedding. It fell apart in less than 12 months. I felt no satisfaction hearing that. Just sadness that my brother made such poor choices. But I also felt validated in my decision. If I had given them that money, it would not have saved their relationship. It would not have solved their fundamental problems. It just would have enabled their dysfunction and left me broke in the process. I learned something crucial through all of this. Loving your family does not mean letting them take advantage of you. You can care about people deeply and still maintain healthy boundaries. You can say no without being a bad person. In fact, sometimes saying no is the most loving thing you can do because it forces people to face their own issues instead of using you as a crutch. I also learned that inheritance is not just free money, it represents something deeper. In my case, it represented 3 years of caregiving, of sacrifice, of showing up when it mattered. Grandma did not give me that money randomly. She gave it to me because I earned it through devotion and love. Nobody else was entitled to it, no matter how closely related they were. Financial freedom turned out to be about more than just money. It was about mental freedom, not owing anyone anything, not feeling guilty for having something I worked for, not letting other people's poor planning become my emergency. That freedom was priceless. I thought about Grandma often in that first year in my new house. When I planted tomatoes in the garden, I remembered helping her with her plants. When I sat on the porch with morning coffee, I remembered our talks on her back steps. She taught me so much about dignity and self-respect, even in her final months. She showed me that you do not have to be mean or cold to stand up for yourself. You just have to be clear about your values. One evening, I sat in my backyard watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. I thought about everything that happened. The manipulation, the family pressure, the ugly confrontation, the aftermath. I did not regret a single decision I made. Not one. I protected what Grandma gave me, and in doing so, I protected myself. I remembered something she told me during one of her last good days. We were sitting in her hospital room and she was talking about her life, her regrets, her lessons learned. She said, "Money shows you who people really are." At the time, I did not fully understand. Now I did. That inheritance showed me exactly who Kyle was, who my parents were in a moment of weakness, who I was when tested, and the lesson I learned, it was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. I learned that I could stand alone if I had to. that I could withstand pressure from everyone I loved and still make the right choice, that I was stronger than I thought. Those lessons would serve me for the rest of my life long after the money was spent. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who felt entitled to something that was yours? Have you had to set boundaries with people you love, even when it hurt? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear your stories. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that protecting yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. Take care of yourselves out there and remember that your peace of mind is worth protecting.